Before 1939, the British in India were the masters of a whole subcontinent. They believed imperial rule was part of the natural order, that only they had the wisdom and organization to rule India effectively. Most Indians led their lives in rural poverty, as they had for centuries before the British arrived. But one man offered them a message of hope and urged all Indians to join a struggle for freedom. Mahatma Gandhi led a mass movement against British rule. Millions followed the marches and boycotts he organized in the 1930s.
If England does not grant your demands, what course of action will you follow then?
Of course, civil disobedience.
Are you prepared to return to jail again?
I am always prepared to return to jail.
After the Second World War, the British no longer had the power or will to hold on. They decided to quit India. It was the start of a shift of power that continued for another 30 years, as the people of the European empires fought to take charge of their own destinies. August 1947, the birth of a nation. With 300 million people, India was about to become the biggest democracy the world had ever known.
Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
Prime Minister Nehru's speech was heard across the country. Birender Kaur was a schoolgirl in Delhi.
We all sat up that night. And then when the dawn came, I cannot describe to you how heady that feeling was. It was as though everything was new. The world was new. The trees were greener, and everything looked as though everything was just too fantastic. You felt you could do anything now that we were free.
Indians poured in to see the handover ceremonies. Satpal Saini came from his village.
14 अगस्त को तो घर में ही रहे हम, अपने खेतों में रहे.
On the 14th of August, we were working in our fields. In the middle of the night, we started our journey to the Red Fort, walking the 9 kilometers on foot. The next morning, there were over 100,000 people there, and the atmosphere was very, very happy. People were shouting slogans in praise of Gandhi. A silver coin of 1 rupee, victory for Gandhiji.
The final scene during this great moment in India's history was the ceremony of the flag in the evening. The saffron, white and green tricolour was publicly unfurled.
First, the Union Jack came down. Then the tricolour went up. It's my happiest memory. For us, at that time, it was something as though we were being given freedom.
The dawn of independence showed that freedom from empire did not mean freedom from bigotry and hatred. In the next few weeks, a terrible price was paid for the speed with which the subcontinent had been partitioned between Hindu India and Muslim Pakistan. Millions were caught on the wrong side of new border lines, drawn up hastily just before independence. Communities were attacked as religious hatreds flared up. Up to 30 million refugees fled, out of Pakistan or out of India, to avoid being caught in a beleaguered minority. Up to 500,000 were slaughtered. The partition and massacres horrified Gandhi, but his pleas for tolerance went ignored. In 1948, he was dead, assassinated by a Hindu extremist. Despite the ordeal of free India's birth, the nationalist leaders had shown the rest of the world what could be done. Gandhi had said that if India broke free, others would follow. He now became an inspiration for subject peoples everywhere. But the European powers saw India as an exception. They hoped to keep the imperial colours stretching round the globe from the furthest points in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, as they had done up to 1939. A fifth of the world's land surface was under imperial rule. Ultimate power over all the people's lives was still wielded by remote governments in Europe, in Belgium or Portugal, Britain or France, who were proud of their achievements.
Cet empire s'est formé lentement, patiemment, par l'effort conjugué des explorateurs, des soldats, des missionnaires, des commerçants et des colons. 1830, conquête de l'Algérie. Nous avons pris pied sur la terre d'Afrique. Après 70, ces soldats et ces marins ajoutent l'Indochine, Madagascar, la Tunisie à son domaine. Par les bienfaits de ses œuvres sociales, elle a élevé le niveau de l'instruction, de la santé et du bien-être des habitants d'un immense empire.
In the Portuguese Empire, Portugal's values came first.
A bandeira de Portugal é sempre içada no alto de um mastro pelos missionários de Cristo nas terras portuguesas das colónias. E assim os indígenas vivem tranquilos à sombra dos dois símbolos tutelares, a cruz e a bandeira da pátria. As missões e o Estado transformaram-nos em ótimos operários. O governo português, cumprindo a missão que incumbe aos povos colonizadores, dotou a colónia de escolas de artes e ofícios, onde os nativos se preparam para a vida do nosso tempo.
Just before the Second World War, a Colonial Office film showed how Britain liked to portray its role.
To guide and develop this vast empire is no easy matter. Hong Kong in the Far East, with its constantly shifting population of Chinese, presents very different problems from Fiji and the islands of the Pacific. Malaya, where the subjects of Eastern sultans live side by side with Western industrialism. Africa, home of more primitive peoples, with colonies spread from the Indian Ocean to the South Atlantic. Control of the destinies of all these colonies lies with the Colonial Office in London. It is here that all plans for the colonies are dealt with, and here all major decisions are taken.
There's a question in the House for tomorrow about nutrition in West Africa.
By 1948, with India free, other Asians in Indonesia and Indochina were fighting armed struggles for their own independence. But the Europeans were most determined to keep Africa. They saw no conflict between paternalism and profit. After the heavy cost of the Second World War, their African colonies seemed more valuable than ever. Europe's needs came first. The best land was used to grow the crops they wanted for export, not food for Africans. In the Portuguese colonies, 98% of Africans remained illiterate. Farmers were forced to be labourers on the big plantations for low cash wages. In Mozambique, Leia Umbasima worked in the cotton fields.
We got little pay. We didn't even have time to work on our own farms to grow fruit and vegetables. We were each given a plot of land to cultivate, wide and long like this, but they still expected us to finish working it in one day. Whoever didn't would be whipped to speed up the work.
In British West Africa, the Gold Coast produced 1/3 of the world's cocoa beans. Africans still ran their own farms, but British companies like Cadbury's held the real power.
Their standards of quality are so high that nowadays the Gold Coast natives refer to the best of anything as Cadbury quality.
To keep costs low for British buyers, the government fixed the cocoa price, though it wasn't presented in quite that way.
All the cocoa nowadays is bought by the government, so that a steady price is given to the farmer and he's protected from the violent price changes which used to occur.
Anima Siful grew up on a cocoa farm.
There
were a lot of British companies in the cocoa business. They sent their agents out to buy cocoa from the villagers. We didn't have our own scales for weighing the beans, so we were really cheated by the agents. We had to accept the prices they gave us. The price was set by the British, and we had no say. Our hands were tied.
The Europeans needed the Africans for the work they could do. They were in no hurry to give them full political rights. At best, the British and French thought Africans might one day run their own internal affairs. But it might take 50 years. The Belgians and Portuguese couldn't conceive of this ever. The aspirations of Africans themselves changed after the end of the Second World War, which altered everything. Colonial troops had fought alongside the British to defend other parts of the empire. They became more aware of the world.
From the jungles of Burma, tough veteran West and East African troops arrive at Bombay on their way home. And their fighting skills struck terror into the Japanese. They were masters of jungle warfare.
They'd learned something else. In India, they'd seen the nationalists challenging the British. Geoffrey Adorma returned to the Gold Coast with a new insight.
Well, the Indians were very, very political. They were very political. We had conversation with some of them. They said, why are we fighting for Britain? Then we say we are fighting for world freedom. So they ask us, are you yourself free? We said, no. I said, well, fight for your freedom first. As I said, this had a very big impression on the Gold Coast soldiers. Me especially, it had a big impression on me.
The African struggle for self-rule, which would soon spread to other parts of the continent, began in the British colony of the Gold Coast, where only 5,000 Britons, mostly traders, lived alongside 2 million Africans. Trouble began when demonstrations led by army veterans turned into violent riots, and 29 were killed. The protests were turned into a mass movement by Kwame Nkrumah, a charismatic campaigner known as Iron Boy. He founded a political party and told Africans, we have the right to govern ourselves. Following Gandhi, he asked Africans to take direct action and demand self-rule immediately. He organized a boycott of British goods and a general strike. The British saw him as a dangerous firebrand, probably under communist influence, and put him in prison. The jailing of Nkrumah gave a new impetus to the campaign to replace rule by the governor through African chiefs with an elected government.
Victory for us in the struggle of CPP. There is victory for us. Forward, ever, backward, never. In the name of great CPP, there is victory.
Komla Bedama, Nkrumah's friend and fellow worker, ran the party in his absence.
To prove not only to the colonial officials...
I had to organize the party around the country at the same time as keeping the machinery of the party going. But we did it all. And to help us do it, one of the tools I used was to have a full life-size photograph of Nkrumah made into 3 parts so that it makes a decent small parcel. And this I carried around as part of my paraphernalia for the campaign. Nkrumah's body is in jail, but his spirit is going on. Now, how can we not vote for such a man?
The mass action brought results. With the colony in ferment, the British finally agreed to a general election. They hoped Nkrumah would lose to more conservative opponents. In 1951, the Gold Coast voted for the first time ever for their own local assembly. There were few white voters. Because of the climate, few Europeans stayed for long or settled in the country. Nkrumah's party won a landslide victory. Reluctantly, the governor had to release him from jail. Now Nkrumah would fight for complete independence. To Africans in the British colonies in East Africa, there appeared to be no prospect of any sort of self-government. What made the difference was settlers. These colonies were recent recruits to empire. In the most fertile parts of Kenya, several thousand Europeans had arrived between the wars, taking over African land. They used Africans as servants and labourers. In a healthier climate than West Africa, they moved in for good, leading a life they could never afford at home. 4 million acres of land were taken from the largest tribe, the Kikuyu. At first, their case was argued by Jomo Kenyatta, who led a popular movement to demand their land back and negotiate self-rule. When the British refused to give way, some Kikuyu formed a secret organization. Living rough in the forests under Mount Kenya, they called themselves a Land and Freedom Army. Waiwaturi joined them.
I joined Mau Mau because of the hardship. The main problem was that our land had been taken by the white man. Then there was education. The schools we used to go to were closed down and destroyed. So we all came together into groups and took an oath. The African was your brother, but when you see a white man, you should know he is your enemy.
Europeans and Africans still walk the streets in fear of the dreaded Mau Mau. For it is that band of fanatics whose bloody deeds have cast a dark shadow across the face of Kenya.
The British used the police and army to round up suspects from the Kikuyu villages. Planes dropped 50,000 tons of bombs to try and destroy the camps. The Mau Mau who tried to shoot them down were soon celebrated as folk heroes. In West Africa, the nationalists had been allowed to take part in an election. In Kenya, the Mau Mau concluded there was no alternative to violence. They used homemade weapons to terrorize European settlers, attacking isolated farmhouses and police stations. Derek and Sylvia Richardson had been in the country for over 20 years.
We were a bit isolated, even more isolated than we are now. But we used to have our guns with us all the time, our revolvers.
The Richardsons' neighbours were among the few to survive an attack. They were two women living alone.
There was a bang on the door. They opened it. This gang came rushing in. And Kitty and Dot shot at these people and killed two of them. And they shot quite a number of bullets. One of them killed their dog, which, of course, was heartbreaking for them because they were devoted to it.
Many Africans opposed the violence, including Kenyatta. Despite a lack of evidence, he was accused of Mau Mau links and imprisoned. 80,000 suspects were detained. Some who weren't Mau Mau still refused to cooperate.
Mtu anaitwa pale kwa raini, maana wamekuja wanakuja moja moja.
We would all be in a line. They'd call the detainees one by one.
Wewe, unajua Mau Mau? No.
Are you Mau Mau? No.
Wewe umekula kiapo?
Have you taken an oath? No.
Unaweza fanya nini?
What will you do if we send you home?
Hakuna?
Nothing.
Kuna kitu. Sema
Tell us
kama
if you are
wewe.
Mau Mau.
On the edge of the African jungle in Kenya, a Mau Mau terrorist fighting British rule of the colony is captured. Two native policemen bring in one of the top leaders of the rebel tribesmen, 34-year-old Dida Kamathi.
The Mau Mau had been defeated by 1956. But by the end, the Kenyan settlers had lost too. British officials saw they couldn't go on protecting a white minority, 1% of the population, in the face of African demands. They knew they'd have to make concessions or risk another rebellion. The authority of the imperial powers in Africa received another major blow with the Suez Crisis of 1956. France and Britain, who'd originally built the canal, failed in their attempt to take it back from the new Egyptian nationalists. For Egypt's leader Gamal Abdel Nasser, it was a triumph over colonial arrogance and presumption. In Cairo, he gave a press conference to Western journalists.
The people know what's going all over the world. People are feeling that they can achieve their independence, their sovereignty, by their own effort. This is the problem. The principles which were declared after the Second World War, the principles of self-determination, liberty, freedom. You may not feel it because you are free and you were free for a long time. But I think during the Second World War you were able to feel it when you were under brute force. This is my personal idea about that.
It was the Americans and Soviets who now held real power, and Europeans could no longer control the pace of change in Africa. The year after Suez, their retreat began. The people of the Gold Coast had had their own assembly under the British, but not independence. In 1957, they became the first black Africans to get complete freedom. Leaders from East and West came to Accra to see the handover. Vice President Nixon represented the United States. He arrived with a delegation that included civil rights leader Martin Luther King.
A new order is coming into being and an old order is passing away. It seems to me that this is fit testimony to the fact that eventually the forces of justice triumph in the universe, and somehow the universe itself is on the side of freedom and justice.
The British were proud of the peaceful nature of the transfer.
For Dr. Nkrumah, main architect of Ghana's independence, this is a day of fulfillment. The longing to be free, the need to be free, these are part of the rightful heritage of man, a heritage denied to colonial Africa until now.
The Gold Coast was renamed Ghana, with a parliamentary system modelled on Westminster. Committing themselves to civil rights, the new government put up a huge commemorative arch.
Here, but a handful of years ago, men laid down their lives for a cause that was not yet won, for freedom, for justice.
Komla Bedema had been with Nkrumah from the start. Now he shared the glory.
And in the subdued light, we mounted the platform and were all ready when the lights all went on at 5 minutes to 12. With me standing on the right hand side of Nkrumah, everybody was happy. The cheering probably is still resounding, but we don't hear it.
At long last, the battle has ended. And thus, Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever. From now on, there is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that, after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs. I want you all, those who have hats on, to take off your hats and let the band play our national anthem. And from now on, that national anthem is the national anthem of the Gogo, to be played on all occasions.
The song of the night was called Freedom Highlife, written by E.T. Mensah, the king of African highlife music.
Ghana, land of freedom, toils of the brave and the sweat of the labor, toils of the brave which have brought results, toils of the brave and the sweat of their labor, toils of the brave which have brought results.
It's very great that day at the Independence Square. People are dancing, singing. They love the music in the song.
The song really symbolizes the saying of Nkrumah, at long last, the battle is ended.
Because we have freedom. We have our freedom.
Ghana, we now have freedom. Ghana.
Already being hailed as the father of African nationalism, Nkrumah gave funds to other nationalist movements and preached the message across the continent.
This mid-20th century is Africa's. This decade is the decade of African independence. Forward then to independence now. Tomorrow, the United States of Africa.
But in much of Africa, the European powers still resisted the demand. The Portuguese would have none of it. The The French put up a bold front. They'd said their colonies had no need for self-government because they were part of a greater France. Instead of independence, the French had offered integration. Selected Africans had been given the right to French citizenship and then encouraged to become black French men and women. A small middle class spoke French and shared French tastes. The special and privileged status of assimilation was granted to only a few.
Ça signifiait beaucoup de choses et rien du tout.
It meant everything and nothing. Everything because your whole social status depended on it.
Social dépendait de ça. Et rien du tout parce que
nothing because for all that, you never really felt like a Frenchman.
Dans la peau d'un assimilé.
The conceit that colonies could be an integral part of the mother country was already failing in the French territory of Algeria, where the large community of white settlers was under attack.
The rebels are believed to have an army of 3,000 well-armed and trained men, as the rebels make an all-out drive to force the French into granting independence, a move France adamantly refuses to make.
The rebel struggle was hard against the might of the French army. But the Arabs weren't interested in being part of a greater France. As the Algerian War continued, and with the news of Ghana's independence in 1957, activists in other French colonies pushed for their own freedom. Amadou Barrow Diène was a student in Senegal.
In 1958, young people were really excited about independence. We were impetuous. We plunged ourselves into the movement because for us independence was the ideal.
En regagnant Paris, après son périple de 20 000 km, le général de Gaulle a pu se féliciter d'une prise de contact directe qui l'a entièrement éclairé sur le problème de la communauté franco-africaine.
Alarmed by the fighting in Algeria, President de Gaulle reluctantly offered France's black colonies self-government, but still hoped they'd stay linked with France. He toured the 12 African territories in 1958 in a last effort to persuade them. When he arrived in Senegal, the first part of his drive into Dakar went smoothly, but then the atmosphere changed. Amadou Barrow Diène and others who wanted full independence now organized a demonstration on the route.
We were here. Things were tense, but we'd taken the precaution of hiding our placards. The moment de Gaulle arrived, we brought the placards and leaflets out. We'd agreed that I should toss the leaflets into the general's car, and I did. And they drove on to the palace with us running behind, shouting, "Independence now."
De Gaulle appealed to the people to remain with France.
Je veux dire un mot d'abord aux porteurs de pancartes. Je veux leur dire ceci. Ils veulent l'indépendance. Qu'ils la prennent. Mais s'ils ne la prennent pas, alors qu'ils fassent ce que la France leur offre, la communauté franco-africaine.
The British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan also toured Africa. At the end of his trip, he acknowledged the new mood.
The wind of change is blowing through this continent. And whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. And we must all accept it as a fact. And our national policies must take account of it.
Africans now got what they'd been asking for faster than anyone had expected. As the British, French and Belgians scrambled out, 25 countries celebrated their independence in less than 3 years. The ceremonies were the same all over the continent. The 12 French territories took full independence. Ivory Coast, Mali, Senegal. But the new leaders knew the real problems they faced. Unity was difficult in new countries whose borders had been drawn up to suit European convenience, enclosing different tribes and languages. Nigeria, Zaire, Rwanda. Few of the nations had enough trained administrators. Tanzania, Uganda, Somalia. The Portuguese held on to their territories, but Kenya finally got its independence in 1963.
Are the Africans ready to and experienced enough to take over the actual administration of government yet?
Yes, they are, certainly.
Do you expect that they will do that, or do you want British civil servants to stay and help?
Oh, we want the help. We want the friends, those who can work under an African government. We want them. But what we don't want is masters.
Ghana started with good prospects. The country was rich from cocoa and gold.
Today, Ghana is a land of the future, and Accra, its capital, a fine modern city.
Once they'd achieved political freedom, all Africans expected tangible improvements to their lives. They wanted economic freedom as well. In Ghana, hopes were high.
Do you think better now?
It's far better than before. Far better.
Do you make more money now?
Yes, please. Make more money. Our trade is on successfully, and we feel happy now than before.
We are happy in everything on account of the independence.
Ghana had all the trappings of a new nation. A brand new airline was training its own pilots. Communications were better.
Hello, London. Hello, London.
Ghana Airways, roads, schools, colleges, universities, harbors, everything. Buildings. You see, these estate houses were all built by Nkrumah for the poor. And you see some poor people now having a house to live in. Education. People like me couldn't have been a lawyer. It's impossible. But when Nkrumah came, he opened the doors for everybody.
Like most of the new African governments, Ghana adopted a socialist system and believed central planning would bring the fastest improvement for the mass of the population. Nkrumah called his version scientific socialism.
Ghana has made challenging and exciting plans for industrial development. They will attract foreign investment and increase and diversify her production, which has hitherto depended largely on the cocoa crop. The spectacular progress made industrially and financially in Ghana has captured the imagination.
The giant Volta Dam would produce all the electricity the country needed and allow aluminium to be smelted in a new plant as well. But in the rush for development, mistakes were made. Ghanaians soon became victims of bad advice and greed. Huge silos built for the cocoa crop were never used. The aluminium smelter was a financial disaster. When he thought the road schemes were too grandiose, engineer Eddie Francois complained to the president's office.
This did not warrant a 4-lane highway. A 2-lane highway at that time would have been enough. There were other places in Ghana which required that money, and that money wasn't put in the right place. Eventually, a friend of my father called me aside and said, hey, keep your mouth shut. Don't interfere with the politics of this game. At that time, it was felt that there was a bit of a rub-off on the party so that the party could be financially strong. The usual thing that was bandied around was that 10% of every project went to the party.
Nkrumah was now gathering all political power into his own hands and building a cult around himself. He was the savior, messiah, redeemer. His picture was seen on shirts, dresses, coins, and stamps. Streets were renamed after him. His titles included Chairman of the Central Committee, Prime Minister, and General Secretary of the party. Ghana became the first of many one-party states in Africa.
More people have been fined for breaking the curfew imposed last Saturday in the city of Accra. 89 people appeared before a magistrate's court. They all pleaded guilty.
The economic promises weren't delivered, and scientific socialism soon turned into autocracy.
People were afraid to speak their minds. You were spied on. Anything you said against Nkrumah could be written down and they'd come and arrest you. If they arrested you, they didn't ask you about what you'd said. They just sent you to prison. If you were there and you died, you died.
Ghana is passing through a revolutionary period. We cannot, under any circumstances, allow imperialists and new colonialists to interlock with traitors in our midst to deflect us from the path of duty and progress.
In 1966, Nkrumah was deposed by his own army. The same Ghanaians who had first worshipped him now turned on him. World cocoa prices had slumped. The state schemes had cost too much. Foreign loans had stopped, and the country was bankrupt. The hopes his people had put in him lay shattered, only 10 years after independence. In some countries, the hopes were shattered in far less than 10 years. In the former Belgian Congo, the passage from empire into chaos was almost instant. The first prime minister of the newly independent Zaire was Patrice Lumumba.
Combattant de l'indépendance, aujourd'hui victorieux, je vous salue au nom du gouvernement congolais.
But Zaire's inheritance was poisoned. Its frontiers were artificial, its people divided. The Belgians had hoped this day would never come. They'd made no preparations for the handover. Few Congolese had higher education. There were no black doctors, no engineers, no senior administrators. The Belgians got out quickly. All the expertise that had run the country departed for Brussels. The army mutinied, and long-suppressed tribal hatred broke out again. Lumumba was captured by the army. Watched by its commander, Mobutu, he was tortured and forced to eat his own words. The few Europeans who'd stayed on were attacked. Ordinary Congolese had been led to believe that with independence, they'd share the riches that had previously gone to Belgium. In fact, after a few months of civil war, the capacity to generate wealth was destroyed. Africans saw homes and offices vandalized, bridges blasted, and the country in ruins. At the same speed that independence days had followed one another in the early 60s, military strongmen took over, usually backed by one of the superpowers. In the Congo, Joseph Mobutu had the support of the Americans, who saw him as an ally in the fight to keep the continent from communism. Africa's military officers claimed they were the only ones who could bring stability. Takeover followed takeover in Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Uganda. Most of the new dictators were cruel and corrupt. For Africans, one kind of repression was replaced by another. Ghana had 14 coups or attempted coups in as many years.
The soldiers neglected us. The soldiers neglected us completely. All they did was look after themselves. We were afraid to go and confront them or complain because they had the guns. You could be arrested and shot. We just had to watch and keep quiet as they were getting richer, and we were getting poorer and poorer.
By the end of the 1960s, the only place where Africans were still ruled by whites was in southern Africa. In Rhodesia, settlers refused to give up power. A white minority government still held power in the Republic of South Africa and would do so for another 25 years. And the Portuguese clung on in a colonial time warp. Portuguese governors still held absolute power in Mozambique and Angola. Africans still worked the farms and plantations for Portuguese owners. But even here, the days when the profits of the colonies could subsidize the home country were about to end. In each of the Portuguese colonies, guerrilla armies were now engaged in a violent struggle to end white rule. In Mozambique, Shadrach Serea fought for the Frelimo guerrillas for 10 years.
It wasn't a matter of fighting men because of their color. The problem was the system which was in force. This system imposed on us, condoned slavery, treated people like animals, and forced them to work on plantations. It allowed people to be beaten, and it limited our rights.
By 1975, the struggle had paid off. Both Angola and Mozambique had their moment of triumph. The Portuguese will to stay had collapsed. Marxist regimes took power in both countries. But there was to be no relief for the people. The new states were thrown into immediate chaos as the Marxists faced rebel groups backed by the West. The symbols of empire were easily removed, but it would be freedom now, civil war tomorrow. With the departure of the last remaining European power, the imperial chapter was almost over, 20 years after the first independence. Soon after, the white settlers' hold was ended in Rhodesia to form independent Zimbabwe. For most Africans, the colonial legacy was a bitter one. They still had to turn freedom from colonial rule into the other freedoms they'd hoped for, but not yet gained. Freedom from hunger, poverty, and oppression. But India, the country that had gained its freedom first, had successfully sustained the world's largest democracy, despite many of the same problems of poverty and ethnic divide. After independence, the Indians took down the statues of kings and viceroys from their plinths in the center of the capital. They moved them to a remote park on the outskirts of Delhi, where they became curiosities, reminders of an increasingly distant era.
You can't keep on being spoon-fed by somebody and being given a little pat on the back and good chap kind of thing. Okay, we made mistakes. We probably will make bigger mistakes. But we are a country, not a colony.
Every year, India celebrated its independence with an assertion of national pride. But for many around the world, it was Mahatma Gandhi who still symbolized the true meaning of freedom and independence.
चरण लेता था उन्होंने कभी चरण नहीं लेने दिए और ये कहा झुको मत झुकाओ.
People would try to touch Gandhi's feet in respect, but he never allowed that. He said, don't bow before another person or another nation.
And there's more in our Lost Decade season later tonight, peeking into Britain's first ever sex survey, considered so shocking in 1949 that it was never published. Don't miss Little Kinsey at 10. But stay with us now for The World next.